Resuming debate, the honourable member Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Wet'suwet'en people, and it's an honor today to be sharing my time with the member for Winnipeg Centre. Canadians are shocked, Madam Speaker. They're shocked to learn the truth that Indigenous people have been telling us for a long time. The validation of 215 unmarked burial sites near Kamloops has brought intense grief, despair, and pain to Indigenous people right across this country. And my heart is with them today, especially the survivors of the residential schools that once stood in Northwest BC, at Lejac, at Kitimat, at Port Simpson, and at Lower Post. My heart is with them and with their families. I say once stood, but in the case of Lower Post, a small village of Deludene just south of the BC-Yukon border, the residential school still stands. In fact, Madam Speaker, since the 1970s, this community has been forced to use the former residential school as its band office. I went there 2 winters ago and I heard stories of how elders who suffered abuse in that building were forced to walk through its doors again and again to access basic services. Survivor Fred Lutz, who was the deputy chief at the time, took me to the basement and showed me the dark place behind the stairs, an image that will stay with me forever. The Deludene have been calling for the demolition and replacement of that building for years. And it was good to hear just recently that in a few short weeks, it will finally be demolished. And that is thanks to the leadership of people like Deputy Chief Harlan Schilling and former Deputy Chief Fred Lutz and their councils and others in their community. A new building will finally be built for the Deludene. It's a long overdue step in the healing process, and we have to ask ourselves, why did it take us so long? I know a lot of non-Indigenous people are feeling sad at the tragic discovery near Kamloops, but what I hear from Indigenous people is that having us indulge in our sadness does not make the situation they face any better. What they want us to do, especially those of us in positions of power and influence, is to fight like hell in this moment when people care about something they should have cared about a long time ago, to fight like hell for real action. That's where this motion comes from, Madam Speaker. We must act now. How is it that 6 years later, so little progress has been made on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action? I remember when they came out in 2015, the very year this Liberal government took power with a majority. How is it that by last year, 2020, there had been only significant action, significant progress on a quarter of the calls to action? How is it that so few of those calls have actually been completed? A portion of this motion requires the government to accelerate implementation of the TRC calls to action related to investigating the deaths and disappearances of children at residential schools, and we've heard much about this in this debate. The Indigenous people I've spoken to over the past week overwhelmingly want the truth. They want to know where the other burial sites are and how many children are there. They want to know where their loved ones are. I was infuriated to learn that in 2009, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked the Harper government for $1.5 million to search residential school properties. $1.5 million. Shamefully, those funds were denied. What would Indigenous communities know today had that money been granted 12 years ago? The call to find all the lost children echoes what I've heard from the families of the women and girls who've gone missing and been murdered along the Highway of Tears in Northwest BC, where I live. And I've been honored to work alongside Brenda and Matilda Wilson, whose beloved Ramona was found murdered along Highway 16 near Smithers in 1996. We worked together to get better public transit along that highway, but what they want more than anything is to know the truth about what happened to Ramona. And 25 years later, they keep encouraging the RCMP's EPANA division to continue its investigation and to not stop until they finally know what happened. The families whose children were taken from them and who never came home want and deserve the truth too, which is why investing resources and expertise in the residential school investigations is so vital. Truth comes before reconciliation for a reason, Madam Speaker. The other parts of this motion are important ones and deserve mention too. St. Anne's Residential School is a long way from where I live in Northwest BC, Madam Speaker, but its story illustrates so clearly the contrast between this government's carefully scripted performative gestures and its relentless denial of basic justice. I won't pretend to know the details of the St. Anne's issue like my colleague, the member for Timmins, James Bay, does, but reading about the government's fight against survivors is nothing short of enraging. How can the federal government explain its department's withholding key person of interest documents that would have helped justly resolve survivors' claims? And how is it, Madam Speaker, that this government continues to spend millions of dollars in its effort to minimize its responsibilities as a result of the Human Rights Tribunal ruling on Indigenous kids in care? The tribunal was crystal clear in its 2016 ruling that services for Indigenous children were being underfunded and that as a result, more kids were being taken away from their families. But the government is fighting that ruling in court, arguing that since the discrimination was systemic, individuals harmed should not be entitled to compensation. The system that facilitated these harms was designed by people, and those people work for our government. It's both astounding and infuriating, and if this motion passes, I hope the government will obey the will of Parliament and call off its lawyers. The people affected by this discrimination deserve no less. And what both the St. Anne's case and the case involving Indigenous child welfare show is that Canada's shameful treatment of Indigenous people continues today. As one person said, it's not a chapter in our history, it's the entire plot of the book. And the people in this place have the power to change it if we have the courage. Last weekend, my friend Dolores told me that people were gathering at Le Jac. It's located west of Prince George near Fraser Lake, about 2 hours from where I live. And so I hopped in my vehicle and I drove out. Le Jac, of course, is the site of the former Le Jac Residential School, to which so many Indigenous kids from communities stretching from Prince George to Hazelton were taken. The former school site is situated on a hill overlooking Fraser Lake, part of the territory of the Notley people. On New Year's Day in 1937, 4 Notley boys between 8 and 9 years old, Alan Willie, Andrew Paul, Maurice Justin, and Johnny Michael escaped from the Le Jac school, setting out to walk 7 miles to their Notley home. They were found frozen to death on the ice of the lake, just a mile short of their destination. It's just one of the hundreds of stories of heartbreaking loss stemming from that place. As I drove up to the site of the former school last weekend, I was struck by how many people had traveled on short notice to be there together that day, to share in their collective grief, to drum and to dance and to honor the survivors still among them, and to stand in solidarity with the families of the children whose remains were found only a few days earlier. I was struck by their resilience and their strength. And most of all, I'll remember Laitle Tene singer Kim Gucci calling all the children present into the center of the circle. And she taught them the actions for a kid's song that she wrote. As she sang, they followed along, touching their toes and reaching for the sky and singing out the words. And the instructions got faster and faster, and the children's laughter rose. Dozens of Indigenous kids laughing and dancing on the exact same ground where that horrible school once stood. It was an expression of joy in a week with so much pain. I'll remember that hopeful sight for a long time, Madam Speaker, and it makes me more determined than ever to fight for the justice that this motion before us represents. I urge every member in this place to vote for this. And after the flags go back up and the news media moves on, let us show Indigenous people that we still hear them and are willing to act. Thank you, Madam Speaker.